Imagine a hall washed in golden light, the flames of 100 candles flickering against carved stone walls. Perfumed smoke drifts in soft curls, a mixture of frankincense, roses, and something faintly bitter, like cloves that overstayed their welcome in a cupboard. You can almost hear the faint rustle of silks as nervous attendants shuffle past, carrying trays of wine, honeyed figs, and wedding gifts that will likely be forgotten by morning. At the far end of this glowing chamber, a door remains closed. Behind it, a princess waits. She has jewels on her head, flowers in her braids, and yet her hands tremble as though they belong to a scribe forced to write an essay with no deadline in sight. You'd probably never make it through a single medieval night, but don't worry, I'll guide you safely through. So before we go any further, if this quiet company helps, you can gently tap like and subscribe, but only if it feels right to your heart. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Maybe lying awake in New York or drifting in a quiet room in London. Drop your time and place below, so none of us feel alone tonight. Now, dim the lights, let your shoulders relax, and let's begin tonight's slow, strange journey, together here on Timeless Sleep. The first thing you need to know about royal weddings is this. They weren't really about romance. If anything, romance was the uninvited guest, like that distant cousin who shows up to the feast and eats all the pickled onions. A royal wedding was about politics, land, treaties, and making sure nobody's army stormed in the next morning, which is all very exciting for ministers and generals, but imagine being the young woman shoved into the centre of it. Everyone's watching, everyone's whispering, and your personal feelings rank somewhere below the quality of the wine served at the after-banquet. Across civilizations, the wedding night was the proof of purchase, so to speak. The alliance wasn't sealed by signatures or wax stamps, it was sealed by what happened, or didn't happen, behind closed curtains. That means the poor princess was less a blushing bride and more a living contract, expected to perform under pressure. Picture your least favourite school exam, but with 20 ambassadors waiting outside and no chance to ask for extra paper. The chamber itself was often staged like a theatre set. Candles, flowers, and elaborate bedding weren't just for comfort, they were signals. The Byzantines adored silks dyed in imperial purple, while in China the bridal room blazed with red silk banners and lanterns. In Europe, the bed might be blessed by priests, sprinkled with holy water as though demons were waiting beneath the sheets. You know it's bad when people think your duvet needs an exorcism. The scents were overwhelming too. Incense was burned to chase away evil spirits, though it mostly chased away breathable air. Oils of myrrh and rosewater were dabbed on the bride's skin until she smelled like a walking apothecary. Imagine showing up for the most nerve-wracking night of your life while reeking like both a rose garden and the bottom shelf of a pharmacy. It's the historical equivalent of mixing every perfume tester at the mall on one wrist. And then there were the witnesses. Yes, witnesses. In certain European courts, noble attendants or even family members escorted the couple into the chamber, sometimes waiting just outside the door. In France, it wasn't unheard of for courtiers to loiter awkwardly while the king and queen were settling in. The logic was that this ensured legitimacy, though in practice it probably ensured no one ever slept soundly again. Imagine trying to relax while your Uncle Bernard is clearing his throat on the other side of the wall. For many princesses, this was their first time leaving the sheltered world of girlhood. In some empires, they were barely teenagers, their hands still clumsy from embroidery lessons. Others had been groomed since childhood to know their body was a chess piece for their dynasty. Either way, the weight pressing on their chest wasn't just from corsets and jewellery, it was centuries of family ambition. One slip, one rumour, one hint of failure, and the entire balance of kingdoms might tilt. No pressure, darling, just the fate of empires resting on your nightgown. But the dread wasn't always only about politics. It was also about the unknown. In Rome, the wedding rituals included carrying the bride across the threshold to symbolise leaving her childhood home. Lovely in theory, terrifying in practice. Many girls had no idea what awaited them after the laughter died down. Imagine being told for years that something mysterious would happen on your wedding night, but no one gave you the handbook. It's like being promised a surprise party and realising the surprise is mandatory childbearing. Even the objects in the room could feel like conspirators. Beds creaked loudly in echoing chambers, as though mocking your every move. Curtains loomed heavy and suffocating, painted with golden threads that glimmered like watchful eyes. The fire popped, Shadows crawled across the walls and every sound was magnified. Somewhere, a servant probably sneezed at the worst possible moment, sealing the story into gossip for decades. In Persia, certain royal weddings required the bride to be veiled until the last moment, a symbolic surrender of self. She would enter the chamber hidden, then unveiled like a sacrifice at the altar. In India, the sacred fire burned in the marriage rite, its crackle reminding brides that their union was not personal but cosmic, meant to uphold Dharma itself. In China, brides wore a red veil over their heads until the groom lifted it, a gesture of unveiling both literally and metaphorically. In every case, the ritual reinforced the same theme. The bride was property being transferred, her fear irrelevant, her trembling almost expected. Still, you can find moments of unintended comedy in the tension. Medieval chroniclers sometimes recorded stories of grooms too drunk to perform, or brides fainting at the sight of the bed, or entire rooms catching fire from overzealous candles. Imagine trying to consummate a political alliance while your mattress is actively smouldering. Nothing says eternal union like scrambling to put out flames with the nearest embroidered cushion. For the princesses, the horror of expectation lingered even in the hours before the wedding night. Servants whispered, older women gave cryptic warnings, and sometimes mothers sat stiffly beside their daughters, unable to explain much but knowing exactly what awaited. The air thickened with dread, heavy as a wool cloak in summer. And through it all, the bride smiled at banquets, nodded to toasts, and performed her role as though she weren't secretly shaking in her slippers. If you imagine all of this together, the scents, the witnesses, the rituals, the whispered warnings, you begin to understand why wedding nights were less about romance and more about survival. Each civilization dressed it differently, but the core experience was the same. A young woman alone in a room that smelled of smoke and roses, facing the terrifying weight of expectation while the world outside held its breath. And remember, history doesn't leave us the screams or the silences. It only leaves us the rituals and the records, the decorations and the contracts. But between the lines, you can almost hear the heartbeat of those trembling brides, echoing across centuries like the faint tap of rain on stone. You picture the door creaking open, and instead of candlelit romance, what greets you is a child, barely tall enough to reach the edge of the bed, dressed in heavy brocade that drags behind her like she's being swallowed by the curtain she just walked through. This is the reality of many royal weddings in ancient courts. Child brides who were pawns long before they even knew the rules of the game. It sounds dramatic, but then again, history never did anything in moderation. If a kingdom could gamble away a coastline, it certainly didn't mind wagering the comfort of a 12-year-old. In ancient Mesopotamia, alliances were sealed with daughters as though they were the most precious cargo on the dock. Records describe princesses being promised to rulers of rival city-states as a way to avoid war, their names scribbled into treaties with all the ceremony of signing for a particularly heavy parcel at the post office. Once the ink dried, the fate of the girl was sealed. One day she was playing knucklebones with servants. The next she was dressed in bridal silks, expected to carry the weight of an empire on her thin shoulders. Egypt was no exception. Pharaohs married sisters, cousins, and even daughters, keeping dynasties pure while also handing young girls over to rituals far beyond their comprehension. Imagine being 10 years old, still fussing about dolls made from linen scraps, and suddenly you're crowned the great royal wife. You might get golden jewellery and a palace suite, yes, but you'd also get a wedding night looming like an execution date on the horizon. Honestly, the dolls start to sound preferable. The dread of these children wasn't just in leaving their families, it was in stepping into an unknown world no one had explained. Education for princesses often focused on charm, etiquette, embroidery and religious rituals, not biology. So when whispers of what happens next reached their ears, it was usually vague, cryptic, or horrifyingly exaggerated. Picture your older cousin pulling you aside and whispering, "It's like being struck by lightning except indoors, and you might cry." Not exactly comforting bedtime material. Romans were slightly more bureaucratic, but no less terrifying. Marriage ages for noble girls could be as young as 12. Imagine being led through a procession where everyone's cheering, throwing flowers, and you're internally screaming, "I literally just learned long division." The Romans liked to disguise their pragmatism with pomp, garlands, torches, chants, but when the doors closed, it was still a child expected to behave like a wife, and if she cried, Well, tears were often interpreted as a sign of good modesty. Translation: if you're terrified, congratulations, you're doing it right. Some cultures layered on additional fear by introducing omens and prophecies. In parts of India, the stars had to align before a marriage could proceed. Astrologers pored over horoscopes, deciding whether Venus was in the right house or Mars was too cranky that week. If the stars approved, the child was dressed in silks and led to the sacred fire, where priests recited chants she barely understood. Imagine being told your entire fate depends on Jupiter's mood, while you're still trying to memorize multiplication tables. In China, during dynasties like the Han and Tang, royal daughters were dispatched as peace brides to cement alliances with steppe tribes. Some were sent hundreds of miles away, never to return. These girls left their homes as children, clutching dolls and perfumed sachets, only to arrive in foreign courts where they were expected to act as wives the moment they could stand upright in embroidered shoes. The bridal night was less a ceremony and more a confirmation that the emperor's treaty was now binding. And yes, there were attendants making notes, as though the whole affair were a business transaction, because essentially it was. What made it worse was how public the private became. In medieval Europe, noble weddings sometimes involved ceremonial beadings, where the couple was escorted to bed in front of witnesses, the curtains dramatically drawn around them, as though the audience was just waiting for intermission snacks. For a child bride, this was humiliation layered with fear. You can imagine her heart hammering in her chest, knowing dozens of eyes had just watched her climb into bed like she was about to sit for the worst exam of her life. And the pressure didn't stop there. Producing an heir was often expected immediately. A child bride might be too young to even carry a pregnancy safely, but dynasties weren't concerned with pediatric medicine. They were concerned with sons. If a bride failed to conceive, or worse, if she delivered daughters, the whispers began. Suddenly she wasn't just a nervous girl, she was a disappointment to the empire. Talk about setting someone up for failure. But let's not forget the absurdities that occasionally lightened the horror. Some chronicles mention child brides fainting mid-ceremony, forcing attendants to fan them with peacock feathers until they revived. Others describe grooms so ancient they fell asleep before the bride even reached the chamber. Imagine being 13 and realizing your biggest rival for attention is your husband snoring. Somewhere between tragedy and comedy, these scenes played out again and again across civilizations. And while we might recoil at the idea, to contemporaries this was normalized. A 12-year-old was of age, a 9-year-old was ready for training, and a terrified princess was simply fulfilling her destiny. The adults around her reassured themselves with phrases like, "She will learn," or "Fear makes her modest." But beneath the rituals and rationalizations was a child, trembling as the door closed and the world expected her to transform overnight into a symbol of political stability. The tragedy of these young brides was not just the fear of the unknown, but the loss of childhood itself. Where most children feared monsters under the bed, these girls feared the bed itself. Their toys were replaced with jewels, their laughter with ceremonial silence, their futures with responsibilities they couldn't yet name, and history, with its endless appetite for dynastic records, seldom paused to notice. In the official scrolls and chronicles, their wedding nights are footnotes, recorded not for the girl's sake but for the empire's. You imagine her again, the child in heavy brocade standing at the threshold. Behind her, a palace of marble and attendants bowing low. Ahead, a chamber thick with incense, shadows dancing on the walls, and a bed that feels more like an execution platform than a place to rest. Her heart pounds, her hands shake, her breath catches. The curtains fall closed, and the world outside waits for proof that treaties have been sealed. History doesn't give us her voice. But if you listen closely to the silence between the records, you can almost hear it. The small, frightened heartbeat of a girl thrust into the role of bride long before she was ready. You can almost hear the crunch of sandals on marble floors, the hush of whispers echoing through a Roman villa as another daughter of a noble house is led into her new life. The Romans had a way of making everything sound like law, even when it was a wedding night. To them, marriage wasn't a personal bond so much as a legal transaction dressed up with flowers, torches, and enough wine to float a trireme. But for the princesses and noble daughters involved, the night was less love at first sight, and more surprise quiz on constitutional law plus body horror. Roman marriage customs were full of symbolism, all designed to hammer home the idea that the bride was leaving her father's world behind and entering her husband's. For instance, she was taken from her mother's arms during the ceremony, sometimes literally carried, because what screams romance more than a staged kidnapping? The ritual was a callback to Rome's own mythic origins, when the first Romans supposedly carried off the Sabine women. Nothing like a little state-sponsored trauma to set the mood. The poor bride's attire didn't help matters. She wore a bright orange veil called the flammeum, draped over her head like a glowing sunset. Pretty in theory, suffocating in practice. Combined with her flame-coloured shoes, she looked less like a blushing bride and more like a walking bonfire, and under all that fabric she was trembling, not because the silk was heavy, though it was, but because she knew what came next. Once the rituals were complete, the groom led the bride to his house. Actually, led is too polite a word. He symbolically dragged her through the threshold to prove she was no longer part of her father's household. Roman historians say this was tradition. Brides probably said it was bruising. Imagine your first walk into your new home being a clumsy tug-of-war with a man twice your size, while guests clapped approvingly. A modern wedding DJ would have a hard time syncing that to a playlist. Inside the home, another ritual awaited. The lighting of the hearth fire, representing the bride's duty to keep the household thriving. The symbolism was clear. Your womb is now the empire's furnace, and please keep it stoked with suns. No pressure. And after this grand performance came the less glamorous finale, the couple's first night together, which Roman society treated with all the delicacy of a gladiator match. You'd think this private moment might actually be private. Think again. In elite Roman families, witnesses often escorted the couple to the bedchamber. Some accounts even hint that relatives waited nearby, just to make sure everything worked. Picture trying to start a new chapter of your life while your aunt is loitering in the hallway, knitting judgment into every stitch. Privacy, apparently, was for peasants. For the bride, this night was terrifying, not just because of the audience, but because of the stakes. A Roman wife's value lay in her ability to produce heirs. A failure on the wedding night could spiral into rumours of infertility, curses, or even divine disfavour. And remember, Romans loved omens. If the lamp flickered at the wrong moment, or the wine spilled, or a dog howled outside, people whispered that the marriage was doomed. Imagine being nervous enough already, then realising the family pug sneezing twice might signal the fall of the Republic. There's also the small matter of knowledge, or the lack of it. Young Roman brides weren't usually given practical advice. Instead, they were bombarded with vague proverbs: submit like the Sabine women, obey as a wife should, or be fruitful. Translation: figure it out on your own, and don't embarrass us. It's like being told to just vibe before a chemistry exam. No wonder brides trembled at the edge of the bed. The Romans also had their quirks. Some sources suggest that beds were sprinkled with symbolic plants like rosemary and laurel for protection. Others mention tying wool around the bride's waist as a fertility charm. Picture this. You're already nervous. Then someone fastens yarn to your stomach and insists it's for your own good. Somewhere in the corner, a cousin is probably muttering, "Tie it tighter, the gods are watching." But not everything went smoothly. Stories survive of grooms too drunk from the feast to even make it into the bedchamber. In those cases, the bride spent her wedding night sitting awkwardly on embroidered pillows while servants whispered outside. Some chroniclers note that brides wept quietly through the night, fearing they had failed even when nothing had happened. Others woke to find their new husbands still snoring on the banquet floor, wreaths crooked on their heads. Nothing like the romance of waking up next to someone who reeks of garum sauce and cheap wine. Still, there was a cruel logic to Roman custom. By emphasizing fear and spectacle, society ensured obedience. A bride who trembled was a bride who remembered her duty. And her duty was clear: bind two families, secure alliances, and produce legitimate heirs who could inherit wealth, titles, or even imperial power. The wedding night was the opening act of that performance, and failure wasn't an option. The irony is that Romans prided themselves on order and law, yet the bedroom, this deeply personal space, was filled with chaos and dread. For the bride, each symbol piled on another layer of fear. The kidnapping ritual, the fiery veil, the dragging over the threshold, the scrutinizing witnesses. It was less a celebration and more an initiation, one that left noble women trembling in their sandals. You picture the room again. A small oil lamp flickers, casting shadows on frescoed walls. The bride sits stiffly on a carved wooden bed, orange veil slipping down, hands clenched in her lap. Outside, voices murmur. Somewhere a lyre plucks a sour note like the soundtrack of a very awkward play. The groom, flushed with wine, staggers in. The curtain falls, the Empire waits, and though the records tell us nothing of her private thoughts, you can almost hear them. How did my life shrink to this one night? How did I become both a daughter of Rome and a prisoner of it? History, as usual, only cares about the treaty secured, the heirs born, the stability maintained. But between those lines, the bride's trembling whispers linger, unrecorded, unheard, and yet somehow eternal. The chamber smells faintly of beeswax candles, wet wool cloaks hung outside, and the tang of too much roasted meat drifting up from the feast below. You picture yourself standing at the threshold of a medieval European castle, the air thick with gossip, and the bride, another young noblewoman, trying not to faint under the crushing weight of expectations. In this world, weddings weren't about delicate whispers of affection. They were about dynastic survival, cold contracts, and making sure everyone remembered who owed whom a fortress or a cowherd. The poor princess, though, she was more like the parchment the treaty was written on, fragile, expected to hold ink, and very likely to be discarded if she tore. Medieval Europe adored pomp. The wedding procession alone could stretch for hours, filled with banners, minstrels and bells ringing so loudly you'd think the apocalypse had finally RSVP'd. The bride was paraded through towns, people staring at her the way modern crowds gawk at celebrities. Only instead of signing autographs, she was signing away her entire adolescence, and by the time the day bled into night and the banquet's final goose leg had been gnawed, the real terror began, the chamber ceremony. In some courts, this ritual was alarmingly public. The bride and groom were led to their chamber in full view of cheering nobles who tossed coins, nuts, or sometimes even shoes at them for luck. Shoes. Imagine starting your new life together, dodging a barrage of footwear like you've accidentally angered an entire cobbler's guild. If the couple made it to the bed without bruises, they were often tucked in ceremonially by attendants, as though bedtime was a group project. Curtains were drawn, prayers were muttered, and somewhere in the shadows courtiers whispered snide bets about how long it would take. The bride's dread wasn't just about the lack of privacy, it was about the layers of meaning wrapped around her body. Her gown had been blessed, sprinkled with holy water, embroidered with symbols meant to protect her from demons. But who was going to protect her from the very real man waiting beside her? For her, the bed was no safe haven. It was a crucible. She had to prove her worth, her virginity, and her obedience all in one night. Failure wasn't just personal. It could mean annulment, disgrace, or even political collapse. That'll help you sleep soundly, won't it? Priests, too, got in on the act. Some bishops wrote long treatises about proper conduct for the wedding night, which is the polite medieval way of saying manuals for nervous brides. The advice usually boiled down to, be submissive, stay modest, and remember that your job is to make babies. Modern translation, pretend you're thrilled about being recruited into an unpaid lifelong internship with no days off. In noble families, virginity tests sometimes followed, bedsheets were checked, maids gossiped, reputations were made or destroyed based on whispers that spread faster than plague in a crowded market. If the sheet wasn't marked with blood, rumours flew. The irony, plenty of women didn't bleed, and plenty of men fumbled their way through the process. But logic wasn't the point. Spectacle was. A princess trembling in fear was part of the ritual, her silence and tears recast as virtue. And then there were the horror stories of consummations turned into performances. In France, certain kings were watched by courtiers through slightly ajar curtains, as if the fate of Christendom hinged on their stamina. England wasn't much better. Noble weddings often had half a dozen witnesses loitering in the hallway, ears pressed to doors waiting for proof of squeaks and sighs. Picture your most embarrassing teenage moment, multiply it by 1,000, and add 3 bishops with clipboards. That was the medieval bridal chamber. For the bride herself, fear was layered. There was the fear of pain, of course. Young women weren't exactly taught what to expect. But there was also the fear of humiliation. Imagine being 17, barely used to corsets, and realizing that your entire social circle is waiting to dissect your performance, like they're critiquing a new cathedral facade. One wrong move, one rumour, and you're branded barren, cursed, or defective. Medieval gossip didn't need TikTok. It spread just fine on candlelit tongues. The absurdity of it all peeked through occasionally. Chroniclers tell of grooms too drunk to manage anything at all, collapsing onto embroidered pillows while the bride sat stiffly beside him, hands folded like she was waiting for mass. Others describe brides fainting, needing to be revived with vinegar-soaked cloths while everyone muttered about whether fainting counted as consummation. Spoiler, it didn't. In some cases, things veered into unintentional comedy. One account from Burgundy describes a groom accidentally locking himself out of the chamber after stepping out for wine, leaving his new wife alone and weeping while half the castle chuckled in the hallway. In another, the bridal bed caught fire from an overloaded candelabrum, forcing the couple to consummate their union in the stables while courtiers tried to salvage the smouldering tapestries. Nothing says forever love like hay poking you in the back, but beneath the laughter was something darker. These girls often had no choice, no agency, no say in what happened once the chamber door closed. Their trembling wasn't just nervousness, it was the body's rebellion against being turned into an object of dynastic survival. And yet, for medieval chroniclers, her terror was invisible ink. They wrote about alliances sealed, lands exchanged, heirs promised. The bride's tears didn't make it into the record, the bishop's blessing did. Still, if you listen closely, you can almost hear those muffled sobs, buried under the sound of cheering nobles and clanging goblets. You can imagine her clutching the edge of the bed, staring at shadows dancing on the stone walls, whispering prayers into her pillow. And outside, the castle keeps celebrating, oblivious, as though the success of the entire realm can be measured by whether or not a frightened girl survives her first night as a wife. So you stand at that threshold again, the hall echoing with laughter, the chamber thick with incense and fear. The bride steps in, trembling in her satin slippers. The curtains draw closed, and the world holds its breath. Somewhere, a rooster crows too early, servants giggle in corners, and the torches flicker. History moves forward, indifferent, and the princess, pressed beneath the weight of duty, becomes another anonymous heartbeat in the endless silence of the medieval night. The corridor hums with low voices, the slap of sandals against mosaicked floors, and the faint metallic clink of guards shifting their spears. You picture yourself stepping into the Palace of Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire, where every stone seems to whisper of intrigue. Here, nothing is just what it appears. A feast might be a trap, a smile might be a dagger, and a wedding night. That could be the most dangerous curtain call of all. For a Byzantine princess, the bridal chamber wasn't simply about love or heirs. It was a performance on which entire dynasties hinged. Byzantine weddings were theatrical, drenched in ritual. First came the processions, endless parades through marble halls glittering with gold mosaics and silk hangings imported from Persia and beyond. The princess was weighed down with jewels so heavy her neck practically needed its own support beams. Every step was watched by bishops, senators, and scheming courtiers, each calculating how this alliance might shift power balances. Imagine walking down an aisle where every guest is less concerned with your happiness and more with whether they'll get a better tax deal from your father-in-law. The ceremony itself had layers upon layers of symbolism. Rings were blessed, crowns placed upon heads, and prayers intoned in Greek so ancient that even the priests muttered them like memorized spells. And then came the wine cup, shared between bride and groom, symbolizing unity. To everyone watching, it looked divine. To the trembling princess, it tasted like surrender in liquid form. But the real test lurked in the chamber. Byzantine society treated consummation not as private intimacy, but as a confirmation of legitimacy. Without it, the marriage could be declared invalid, alliances shattered, and entire factions of court politics thrown into chaos. If the bride was nervous, well, too bad. Her nerves weren't on the agenda. The fate of Constantinople was. The palace spies made sure of it. Servants whispered at doors, eunuchs stationed nearby, accidentally lingered, and rumours flew faster than doves in the hippodrome. Some chronicles even suggest that witnesses remained in the room until the curtains were drawn, then hovered just beyond earshot to ensure the right noises occurred. Privacy. That was a luxury reserved for peasants who didn't matter. A princess's body belonged to the empire, and the empire demanded proof. And the danger wasn't only in humiliation. The Byzantine court was a nest of vipers, where rivals schemed over everything from trade routes to who got the juiciest slice of roast peacock at banquets. If a princess failed to perform, her enemies pounced. Whispers of infertility, curses, or divine disfavour spread instantly, and in Constantinople whispers could kill faster than swords. More than one empress was deposed or exiled after accusations of barrenness or misconduct. The bridal bed was less a place of silk sheets, and more a political tightrope strung over a pit of crocodiles. Take Anna Komnene, for instance, the princess-turned-historian. Though her own marriage was politically arranged, her writings drip with sarcasm about the machinations of court life. She knew that every bridal chamber was essentially a battlefield, with the bride as unwilling soldier. One wrong move, one wrong rumour, and the knives of her rivals were already sharpening. The rituals surrounding the bridal chamber added to the pressure. The bed itself was often decorated with embroidered silks bearing Christian symbols, crosses, angels, prayers, making it feel less like a marital space and more like a holy altar. The irony. A trembling bride kneeling in prayer on sheets that would soon be scrutinized like evidence in a trial. Some accounts say priests blessed the bedchamber itself, sprinkling holy water as though demons were lurking in the curtains. Given the politics of Constantinople, they probably were. The dread was compounded by the Byzantine obsession with omens. If a candle flickered out suddenly, it was taken as a bad sign. If the fire roared too brightly, also a bad sign. If the bride sneezed at the wrong moment, disaster. Imagine trembling on your wedding night and realizing even your allergies might be interpreted as divine commentary. Somewhere in the palace, an astrologer was already scribbling doom into the stars. The absurdity crept in too. Chroniclers record emperors so intoxicated they never made it to the bridal chamber, leaving brides to sit awake, alone, with eunuchs gossiping outside. Others describe entire feasts spilling into the chamber, with drunken courtiers barging in to check whether the marriage was properly sealed. Picture being a terrified 16-year-old girl, while your new husband's cousin, full of wine and walnuts, shouts encouragement from the foot of the bed. For the bride, though, the fear was rarely comedic. Many Byzantine princesses were married off not to charming young nobles, but to much older men, foreign rulers, or even barbarian kings. A Greek girl raised in the glittering halls of Constantinople could find herself shipped off to Kiev, the Balkans, or beyond, her first night in a strange land surrounded by strangers who spoke not a word of her language. Trembling wasn't just about the act itself, it was about losing every anchor she'd ever known, and the stakes were relentless. A successful consummation meant the alliance held, her position was secure, and her family's influence grew. A failed night meant annulments, disgrace, or exile to a convent, where she might spend the rest of her life embroidering altar cloths and staring out windows. The bridal chamber wasn't a sanctuary, it was an audition, and the judges weren't merciful. Still, if you close your eyes, you can imagine her. Jewels weighing heavy in her braids, cheeks flushed from too much wine and too little choice, standing in a chamber lined with silk and shadows. Outside, the hum of the palace never stops. Ministers whispering, guards shifting, eunuchs watching. Inside, she kneels briefly, whispering prayers to Christ and the Virgin, asking for courage. Then the door closes. The curtain falls, and Constantinople holds its breath. The chronicles record only whether the marriage succeeded, whether heirs were born, whether treaties held. They don't tell us about the trembling hands, the tears quickly wiped away, the prayers whispered into silk pillows. But those things were there, echoing in the silence, just as real as the golden mosaics and jewelled crowns. In Byzantium, where everything was politics, even fear was a performance. Word count 1,546. You said, continue, write this section. Exactly between 1,500 to 1,550 words, ChatGPT said, section 6. The sound of sandals scuffing against marble gives way to the hush of slippers brushing over polished tiles, this time in a palace far grander and more secretive than Constantinople. You picture yourself entering the harem of Topkapi in Istanbul, where walls are painted with intricate patterns of blue and gold, and every hallway feels like it holds a whisper it refuses to repeat. Here, an Ottoman princess prepared for her wedding night, not as a girl about to start a personal life, but as a living strategy her family placed carefully on the board of empire. Ottoman weddings were wrapped in layers of ritual that seemed dazzling on the surface and suffocating underneath. Imagine the procession. The princess covered in silks heavy with jewels, veiled so deeply she might as well have been a statue, surrounded by guards, musicians and officials announcing her fate. The streets echoed with drums and flutes, and the people cheered, not for her happiness but for the empire's strength. If you looked at her face beneath the veil, though, you'd find trembling lips pressed tight, as if they already knew the weight of the night ahead. The Ottoman court was obsessed with appearances. The wedding chamber wasn't merely a room, it was a stage designed to proclaim dynastic control. Rich carpets imported from Persia lined the floors, perfumed lamps flickered, and gilded bedding shimmered beneath the glow. But for the princess, every golden thread felt like a chain. She knew eyes and ears lingered just outside the chamber, eunuchs stationed to ensure the ritual was fulfilled, courtiers eager for proof the alliance was sealed. Privacy didn't exist, only surveillance disguised as tradition. Fear began long before she stepped into that chamber. Many Ottoman princesses were married to men they had never met until the wedding. Often these men were powerful governors, military commanders, or foreign allies, strangers who now held not just her hand, but her future. Sometimes the groom was decades older, his beard streaked with grey while she was still barely past girlhood. Imagine sitting beside such a man at the banquet, forced to smile, knowing that soon the feast would end and the true ordeal would begin. The dread wasn't only personal. In Ottoman politics, marriages weren't just about joining families, they were about controlling provinces, armies and fortunes. If a princess failed to please, or worse, failed to produce heirs, her entire family's influence could crumble. The Sultan might see her as a liability, her brothers might treat her as a pawn gone wrong, and the court might whisper that she carried some curse. The pressure on her body was immense, as though she carried the weight of the empire in her womb. Nothing says romance like geopolitical stress. Ceremonial details made the night even more surreal. Some traditions included presenting gifts in the bridal chamber itself, gilded mirrors, silk robes, or trays of sugared almonds meant to symbolize sweetness in the union. Sweetness, of course, was relative. Imagine being handed a tray of candy while your hands are shaking so hard you can barely pick one up. Outside, the music might still play, but inside the chamber, the silence roared louder than the drums, and then there was the veil. In many Ottoman rituals, the princess remained veiled until the groom himself lifted the fabric. To the courtiers watching, this symbolized submission and unveiling. To the bride, it was the moment her world disappeared. Beneath the veil, she could hide her fear, her trembling lips, her wide eyes. But once it was lifted, she was exposed, not just to her husband, but to history's gaze. Whispers from the harem added to the dread. Older women, concubines, and attendants often shared cryptic warnings, half-jokes meant to prepare the girl but only feeding her anxiety. "Don't flinch," one might whisper. "Don't speak unless he speaks first." Another might mutter, "If you cry, let it be quiet." Imagine being 16, dressed in pearls, and handed advice better suited for surviving a courtroom interrogation. The absurdities of the Ottoman court made things even stranger. Some grooms arrived drunk on sherbet spiked with too much wine. Others were so nervous themselves they couldn't lift the veil without fumbling. Eunuchs stood in the hall with straight faces, but you know some of them must have exchanged knowing glances when things went awkwardly. After all, gossip was the lifeblood of the harem, and nothing fueled it faster than a shaky wedding night. But for the princess, none of it was funny. Her trembling wasn't just about the moment, it was about the lifelong consequences sealed within it. If she succeeded, she might rise in influence, wield quiet power, and secure her family's favour. If she failed, she risked being cast aside, relegated to a forgotten corner of the palace, or worse, sent away to live in lonely exile. The wedding night wasn't about intimacy. It was a test of survival. Imagine her again, seated on the edge of a low cushioned bed, carpets soft under her slippered feet, lamps casting golden shadows across tiled walls. Her veil hides her face, but you can see her hands trembling in her lap. Outside, faint laughter drifts down the corridor, courtiers toasting, musicians still plucking strings. Inside, she waits, knowing that soon the veil will lift, the silence will deepen, and her life will change forever. History records the treaties signed, the provinces gained, the heirs born, but it doesn't record the whispers she muttered into her veil, the prayers she whispered under her breath, the tears that stained silk before anyone noticed. Those things are lost to time, buried beneath gold leaf and official chronicles. Yet if you lean close, if you listen past the pomp and the politics, you can almost hear them, the heartbeat of an Ottoman princess, trembling in the gilded dark. The night air in Persia carries the scent of crushed rose petals, smoke from braziers, and the faint metallic tang of swords kept close at hand. You picture yourself following a veiled princess into a marriage tent glowing with lamplight, the silks of her gown catching the firelight like ripples on water. Outside, tribes gather, nobles murmur, musicians pluck at lutes, but inside the tent the air grows heavier, thick with expectation. For Persian royalty, a wedding was never just about the bride and groom. It was about treaties with tribes, promises of peace, and power balanced as delicately as the lamps swaying in the night breeze. And for the princess herself, trembling on the edge of the bed, the night was less about love and more about survival. Persian marriage customs wrapped the bride in layer after layer of symbolism. She often entered veiled, sometimes so completely that she could see little more than shadows of the room. The veil was more than fabric. It was a wall, a reminder that her face, her body, and even her thoughts no longer belonged solely to her. When the groom lifted it, it wasn't simply a gesture of intimacy. It was the empire peeling away her last defence. You can almost feel her clutching the folds of silk, wishing for more time, more breath, more control. Ceremonies often began with fire. In Zoroastrian traditions, the sacred flame burned brightly as a witness to the union, its light symbolising purity and eternal truth. But imagine being a terrified young bride, watching fire crackle and flare, reminded that even the gods seemed to be staring in judgment. Every snap of the wood was like a cosmic gavel declaring her duty, and duty was never gentle. The marriage tent itself was a paradox. Draped in luxurious textiles, embroidered with gold threads, filled with cushions and perfumes, it looked like a dream from the outside. But for the bride, it was a stage set. Guards lingered nearby. Attendants whispered just beyond the curtain, and she knew that even her silence could be reported. If she cried too loudly, someone might say she resisted. If she was too quiet, someone might claim she was unwilling. Imagine being judged not by what you said, but by how you trembled. Political stakes sharpened the fear. Many Persian princesses were married off to secure alliances with rival dynasties or nomadic tribes. Their bodies became signatures of treaties, and their wedding nights the ink that sealed them. If the marriage failed to be consummated, or if whispers suggested the bride resisted, alliances could collapse, wars could reignite, blood could spill. No pressure, just the safety of half the empire depending on whether you managed to smile through the dread. And then came the rituals of witness. In some traditions, gifts were presented at the threshold of the tent, trays of dates, honey, and nuts meant to symbolize fertility and sweetness. The irony of nibbling almonds while you silently shook with fear didn't seem to bother anyone. In fact, the symbolism piled higher and higher until it nearly suffocated the bride. Honey meant harmony, pomegranates meant children, carpets meant stability. Imagine sitting on a mountain of metaphors while wishing for nothing more than a locked door. The veil ceremony could be particularly terrifying. The groom would lift it, revealing her face not only to himself but to the attendants, standing just close enough to witness. It was as though the entire world was waiting to confirm she had transformed. From daughter of Persia to wife of someone else, from symbol of innocence to vessel of dynastic hope. The trembling beneath that veil wasn't just modesty, it was the body's last protest against becoming a contract. But Persian weddings also carried absurdities that must have struck even the brides as bizarre. Chroniclers tell of processions so elaborate that camels were draped in silk, elephants painted with gold, and slaves forced to carry candelabra heavier than themselves. Imagine being a princess in that procession thinking, "Wonderful, the camels are glowing like lanterns, but I still have no idea what's about to happen to me tonight." When you're dreading the chamber, elephants in makeup probably don't help. And then there were the astrologers. Persian courts, like many others, loved to consult the stars before major events. If the heavens didn't align, the wedding night might be postponed, or worse, rushed ahead to avoid unlucky hours. Imagine trembling in your silks while some bearded man with charts mutters, "Mars is cranky tonight, best get on with it." Nothing says romance like being told your intimacy schedule is set by planetary mood swings. The dread of Persian brides also came from the possibility of exile. If the marriage soured, if heirs weren't produced, or if the bride fell out of favour, she could be cast aside, sent to a distant estate, or hidden away in obscurity. Every sigh, every whisper, every tear on the wedding night might echo for years in the halls of power. One wrong rumour, and she was finished. Yet amid the fear, there were flickers of humanity. Some accounts hint that brides found brief solace in rituals. Lighting the sacred fire gave them a moment to breathe, to whisper private prayers. The scent of rosewater sprinkled over the bed could be a fleeting comfort, a reminder of home. Even the sound of the musicians outside, flutes weaving melancholy tunes through the night, might have felt like a fragile thread of connection, keeping her from dissolving completely into dread. Picture her now, seated on a cushion in the glowing tent. Rose petals scatter around her, incense coils into the air, shadows dance against embroidered walls. Her veil is still down, her hands grip her lap, and her breath comes shallow. Outside, the empire waits. Generals, priests, astrologers, family. Inside, she is one heartbeat away from losing the last piece of herself. The veil will lift, the silence will thicken, and her trembling will become history's invisible ink. The chronicles, of course, only record the outcomes. Treaties secured, heirs born, provinces pacified. They don't tell us about the quiver in her voice, the tear soaking into silk, the desperate wish to be anywhere but there. But if you pause, if you listen to the spaces between the words, you can almost hear her. A Persian princess, trembling in a lamplit tent, carrying the weight of an empire on her slender shoulders, whispering to the night that she never chose. The word count 1540. You said, continue. Write this section exactly between 1500 to 1550 words. ChatGPT said, Section 8. The scent of smoke and buttered bread still lingers from the feast, but now it is drowned beneath the perfume of sandalwood, jasmine, and incense so thick it almost feels like a second veil wrapped around you. You picture yourself walking barefoot across a carpet of petals into the heart of an Indian palace courtyard, where torches flare against the night and the hum of chanting priests carries above the crowd. At the centre sits a young princess, her ankles weighed down with golden anklets, her wrists jingling with bangles, her head bowed beneath a crown of flowers that seems heavier than her own skull. Tonight, before the sacred fire, she's about to become not just a wife, but a symbol of cosmic duty. And her trembling? That is swallowed by the fire's crackle and the chant of mantras echoing against the walls. Hindu wedding rituals, especially for royal families, were steeped in symbolism. The sacred fire, Agni, was lit at the centre of the courtyard, glowing fiercely as if it had been waiting centuries for this moment. Bride and groom circled it 7 times, each circuit binding them tighter in the eyes of gods, ancestors, and the entire watching court. Every step was choreographed, every mantra murmured in Sanskrit, every gesture a reminder that this union was not about them, but about maintaining Dharma, the moral order of the universe. And for the trembling princess, that was terrifying. Who wants their private fear to suddenly feel like it's upsetting the balance of cosmic law? From childhood, Indian princesses were taught that their bodies would serve their kingdoms. Marriage was destiny, whispered into their ears as lullabies, embroidered into their wedding saris long before they could even pronounce the word sari. Yet when the night finally arrived, the reality was no less overwhelming. She was decked in red, the colour of both fertility and fire, so vivid it made her look like a living flame. Her eyes lowered, her lips pressed tight. She appeared serene to the audience, but inside she was shaking as though her bones were hollow reeds. The rituals piled one atop another. Priests tied the bride's sari to the groom's scarf, knotting their garments together as a visible sign of union. Flowers were tossed over their heads, showering them like blessings, though some must have felt more like tiny missiles landing in her hair. Families exchanged gifts, elephants, horses, trays of gold coins, all more valuable to the court than the girl standing quietly by the fire. And still the chanting continued, relentless, like the ticking of a cosmic clock. The princess had no script except obedience. And then came the Kanyadan, the ritual gift of the maiden. Her father's hands would literally place her into her husband's, as though she were a jewel being transferred, a possession sealed with blessings and tears. Everyone applauded. For the princess, though, it was the moment the last thread of her childhood was cut. No longer daughter, not yet wife, she was suspended in fear, staring at the fire, willing it not to notice how badly she trembled. The dread sharpened after the rituals ended and the palace emptied into laughter and feasting. Because then came the chamber. Unlike the sacred fire, the bridal chamber was less cosmic and more suffocating. The bed was covered in flowers, garlands hung from the ceiling, oil lamps flickered, and perfumes filled the air until it was almost hard to breathe. Guests outside still whispered and giggled, eager for the moment the groom would lift the veil and claim his bride. Inside, the girl sat waiting, her bangles rattling faintly with each tremor of her hands. Astrologers played their role here too. Marriages weren't scheduled without consulting the stars, and even the first step into the chamber might be timed to match auspicious moments. If Venus was in a good house, the night began. If Saturn scowled, the bride might be kept waiting hours while priests muttered mantras. Imagine trembling on a flower-strewn bed, your entire fate decided by constellations you couldn't even see. "We'll begin as soon as Mars chills out," might as well have been the official instruction. The fear wasn't only about the unknown, it was about the crushing responsibility. In Indian courts, queens were expected to bear sons who would secure dynasties, expand empires, and keep the sacred fire burning for generations. Failure meant disgrace, whispers of curses or worse, being supplanted by rival wives or concubines. One night, one trembling girl, and an entire empire poised to judge her womb. That kind of pressure doesn't exactly make for restful sleep. Absurdity, however, threaded through the solemnity. Chroniclers describe palaces so overloaded with flowers that servants sneezed their way through ceremonies, leaving the poor bride gasping beneath a mountain of petals. Others tell of grooms so stuffed from feasting that they collapsed into food comas before even reaching the chamber, leaving brides sitting awkwardly while relatives teased them mercilessly. Imagine trembling all night while your new husband snored beside you, one hand still clutching a half-eaten mango. The princess's trembling was seen as modesty, even virtue. A bride who shook with fear was praised as pure, obedient, humble. No one cared that her heart was hammering because she was terrified of pain, humiliation, or rejection. Instead, her trembling was rebranded as proof of her worthiness. Translation: if you're scared out of your mind, congratulations. You're already a role model. Picture her now, seated on the edge of a bed strewn with roses, anklets chiming faintly as her feet tap nervously. Outside, the laughter of courtiers still echoes. Inside, the lamps burn low, shadows stretch across the walls, and the air feels too heavy to breathe. Her veil still hides her eyes, but beneath it you know she's wide-eyed, whispering silent prayers to every god she knows: Vishnu, Shiva, Parvati, anyone who might listen. And when the veil is lifted, when the silence deepens, she will cross a threshold that cannot be reversed. History records the alliances secured, the dynasties born, the palaces built. But it leaves unrecorded the voices of trembling brides, their whispered mantras of fear, their tears hidden beneath veils and garlands. Still, if you lean close, you can almost hear it. The sound of bangles rattling softly in the night, a princess's heartbeat louder than the crackle of the sacred fire. The night is drenched in red. You picture yourself stepping into a chamber lined with crimson silk, lanterns glowing like captured suns, shadows sliding across carved screens. In imperial China, weddings were spectacles of order and symbolism, yet for the princesses caught in their web, the wedding night was less a moment of joy and more a theatre of trembling nerves. Every detail, from the colour of the curtains to the timing of the bride's veil, was choreographed with cosmic precision. And beneath that careful choreography, one girl sat shivering, her fate tied tighter than the knots in the silk that bound her. Chinese tradition elevated red to the colour of marriage. It symbolised luck, happiness, and fertility. So the bride was swaddled in it head to toe, red gown, red shoes, red veil that covered her face like a scarlet curtain. She was more symbol than person, transformed into a walking omen of prosperity. To the guests cheering outside, she was the embodiment of joy. To herself, she was a prisoner wrapped in silk, each step a muffled drumbeat of dread. Imagine staring at the world through red gauze, knowing your next sight would be the man who now defined the rest of your life. The rituals began before she even left her family's palace. Hours of combing, pinning, and powdering turned her into a porcelain figure, stiff with hairpins that weighed more than a small bird. Every gesture was rehearsed. Bow here, smile faintly there, lower your eyes always. Mothers whispered advice, cryptic, careful, often terrifying. Obey him in all things, one might murmur. If you fear, show nothing. Another might add, if he is cruel, endure silently. Not exactly motivational pep talks. The journey to the groom's house was itself a ritual. The princess was carried in a red sedan chair, its curtains drawn tight, drums and firecrackers exploding in the streets to chase away evil spirits. Inside the swaying chair she sat trembling, surrounded by attendants but utterly alone. She could hear the cheers outside, the crackle of fireworks, the neigh of horses, but she could not see her future. She could only imagine it, and the imagining was worse than any reality. Once at the groom's home, the veil ceremony began. The bride was led into the chamber, seated stiffly on the bed, her hands folded in her lap. The groom, sometimes a stranger, sometimes a man decades older, lifted the veil with a long stick or branch, a gesture meant to reveal her face as though unveiling a treasure. To the attendants watching, it was tradition. To the bride, it was exposure. The moment her trembling could no longer be hidden, the silk fell away, and the weight of her new life settled heavier than all the gold ornaments on her head. The bridal chamber itself was designed as a fertility charm. The bed was decorated with embroidered quilts of dragons and phoenixes, symbols of masculine and feminine power united. Children, often chosen for their good fortune, were invited to jump and play on the bed beforehand, ensuring the couple would produce many heirs. Imagine sitting on the edge of your bed, pale and anxious, while a group of toddlers tramp across your sheets shrieking with laughter, stamping good luck into the mattress. Terrifying. Yes. A little absurd. Absolutely. The absurdities piled higher. Bowls of peanuts, dates, and lotus seeds were placed nearby, their names punning on words for many sons. Servants whispered prayers as they tucked embroidered pillows into place, as if cushions alone could secure a dynasty. Firecrackers popped outside, lanterns bobbed in the courtyards, and through it all, the princess trembled. She was surrounded by symbols of fertility, yet she herself felt like a shadow trapped in red silk. And then came the silence. When the guests withdrew, when the attendants slipped away, when the laughter faded down the corridors, the princess was left in the chamber with her new husband. The silence must have roared in her ears. She had no training for this, no script beyond obedience. If he was kind, perhaps the fear would fade. If he was cruel, she would endure it in silence because endurance was her inheritance. In either case, the world outside would judge her not by her words, but by the heirs she produced. The pressure was suffocating. Imperial daughters were more than brides. They were political glue. Their marriages secured alliances with rival families, cemented peace with foreign rulers, or bound powerful generals to the throne. A failed union could ripple outward into rebellion or war. So the trembling of a princess wasn't simply a matter of nerves. It was the body's instinctive response to carrying an empire on her shoulders. Every shiver, every stifled sob was a protest against being reduced to a contract. And yet, the records described these weddings as joyous. Court historians wrote of dazzling silks, lavish banquets, rows of guests marvelling at the splendour. They described the bride's modesty, her lowered eyes, her trembling hands, all praised as virtue. What they did not write were the private moments, the tears shed beneath the veil, the whispered prayers to ancestors, the desperate wish to return to the safety of childhood. Those were not fit for the annals of dynasties. Those lived only in the silence between the lines. Still, absurd comedy lurked in the corners. Some accounts tell of grooms too nervous to lift the veil properly, poking the poor bride in the forehead with the ceremonial stick. Others mention firecrackers accidentally igniting carpets, forcing everyone to stomp out flames while the couple sat frozen on the bed. And surely, in the echo of laughter that followed, some brides must have felt their fear momentarily ease, only for the silence to return like a shadow once the hall cleared. Picture her now, seated on a phoenix-embroidered quilt, red silk pooling around her, lanterns painting her face in flickering gold. The veil has just fallen, her husband's eyes upon her, the air thick with incense and expectation. Outside, the last of the firecrackers sizzles into silence. Inside, her hands tremble in her lap, each bang of her heart louder than the fireworks themselves. History records only that the marriage was made, heirs produced, dynasties secured. But if you lean closer, if you listen to the quiet beneath the red silk, you can almost hear her. A princess whispering to herself in the crimson dark, praying that trembling would not betray her fear. The air is hushed, perfumed with cedar smoke curling from a brazier, and the soft rustle of sliding screens fills the silence like whispers no one wants to admit. You picture yourself entering a Heian-era mansion in Japan, where the walls are painted with delicate screens of cranes and blossoms, where the garden outside glimmers faintly with moonlight on raked gravel. The corridors are long, dim, and silent, designed less for sound and more for shadows. And in one of these rooms sits a noble princess, folded into layers of silk so heavy they pin her to the floor, waiting for a wedding night that feels more like a sentence than a celebration. Japanese noblewomen in the Heian period were famed for their elegance. Their gowns, the junihito, were composed of up to 12 layers of silk, dyed in colours meant to harmonise with the season. Beautiful, yes, but suffocating when you were already trembling. Imagine trying to breathe beneath fabric so thick you can barely move, knowing that soon someone will peel it away layer by layer while the entire household listens from beyond the paper walls. Each rustle of silk becomes thunder in the silence. The wedding rituals themselves were understated compared to the pomp of Europe or Persia. There were no firecrackers, no elephants painted with gold. Instead, there was poetry, subtle gestures, and an almost unbearable emphasis on formality. A bride and groom might exchange waka poems before the night began, each line weighed with meaning, metaphor, and unspoken expectation. To an outsider, it looked refined. To the bride, it was terrifying. Her hands shaking as she held the brush, trying not to smear the ink as her heart pounded. If she failed to impress with her words, what hope did she have with everything else? Privacy was an illusion. Japanese houses were built with paper-thin walls, and servants, relatives, and attendants lingered close. The bridal chamber might be separated by sliding screens, but screens don't block whispers. Every laugh, every creak of the floor, every caught breath would carry. Imagine trying to quiet your fear in a house where silence is as sharp as a blade. If your voice trembled, if your body shook, someone would know, and someone would tell. The dread of noble brides was also tied to status. In Heian society, marriages weren't always about love but about political rank. A princess might be married into a powerful family to secure alliances between clans. Her husband could be a man she barely knew, or worse, one she had only seen at court functions, his face obscured by layers of etiquette and formality. She might not even recognise his voice clearly. Imagine sitting in a dim room, waiting for a man you could not pick out of a crowd, and realising he now defines your future. Symbolism clung to every detail. The bedding was arranged meticulously, often on raised tatami mats with quilts embroidered with cranes and pine trees, symbols of longevity and endurance. Incense burned in the corners, filling the air with sweet smoke meant to calm the bride, though it often suffocated more than soothed. A branch of pine might be placed nearby to remind the couple of steadfastness. Lovely in theory, but for the trembling girl staring at the smoke-stained ceiling, it all felt like props in a play she hadn't rehearsed for. The absurdities of Heian rituals sometimes made the trembling worse. Some grooms arrived late, delayed by endless rounds of poetry or too much sack at the banquet. Brides were left sitting motionless for hours, layered in silks, barely able to shift their weight. Imagine waiting so long that your legs go numb, only to have a stranger arrive at midnight, bow stiffly, and begin peeling off layers of silk while you're praying your foot doesn't cramp audibly. Hardly the stuff of romance scrolls. And then there was the silence. Heian culture prized subtlety, restraint, and quiet. Loud emotions were frowned upon, so a bride could not cry, could not protest, could not even gasp too audibly. She was expected to sit gracefully, trembling invisibly, as though her fear itself were a breach of etiquette. Trembling, however, has a way of betraying itself. A quiver in the hand holding the fan, a flicker of movement in the embroidered sleeve, a faint chime of bangles at the wrong moment. To the bride, every tremor was a failure. To the watching attendants, it was proof of modesty. The cruelest irony, her terror was taken as virtue. And beyond the chamber, politics lurked. Heian brides were not simply wives, but pawns in a chess game of clans. If she bore sons, her family gained influence at court. If she failed, her clan weakened. And should she falter on the wedding night, whispers of incompetence could doom her reputation before it had even begun. A trembling princess was not just a nervous girl. She was a clan's gamble, a potential empress, a fragile thread holding power in place. Absurd comedy sometimes intruded on the dread. Diaries from the Heian court mention grooms so drunk they collapsed before the chamber curtain, leaving brides stiffly waiting while attendants dragged the man to a corner. Others describe brides so heavily dressed they fainted from heat, forcing servants to rush in with fans while the groom hovered awkwardly. Picture it, a nobleman reciting poetry over the limp form of his bride, fanning her while trying to salvage dignity. If fear didn't knock her out, the sheer number of silk layers might. Yet for the princess herself, nothing was funny. She sat in that quiet room, incense curling around her, the faint scratch of a cricket outside the only sound besides her own heart. Her fan trembled in her hand, her eyes lowered, her lips forming prayers she dared not speak aloud. When the screen slid open and her husband entered, the silence grew even heavier. Beyond the paper walls, the household waited, listening. Inside, she crossed the threshold of girlhood into a role she had never chosen. History remembers Heian brides for their elegance, their beauty, their poetry. It does not remember the trembling hands hidden in sleeves, the tears blinked away beneath painted brows, the desperate wish that the silence would swallow them whole. But if you lean close, if you listen beyond the delicate lines of waka poems and painted scrolls, you can hear them still. The rustle of silk, the hitch of breath, the heartbeat of a princess praying the night will pass quickly. The air is thick with drums. You picture yourself in the courtyard of an African royal palace, maybe in Ashanti lands, maybe in the highlands of Ethiopia, where the beat of carved drums rolls like thunder, and the night sky glitters with stars sharp as spearheads. Torches blaze against carved wooden pillars, dancers stamp in circles, their shadows leaping against the walls. The scent of roasted meat mixes with palm wine, frankincense, and the earthy smell of dust kicked up by the crowd. In the middle of this whirl of noise and colour, a princess sits silent, her bracelets clinking softly, her body trembling in ways no one in the cheering crowd can see. African royal weddings were as public as they were private. The celebrations themselves were joyous, filled with song, dance, and lavish feasting. Guests poured in from far villages, warriors strutted in ceremonial armour, griots sang genealogies stretching back 100 generations. For everyone else, the night was music and laughter. For the princess, it was the weight of expectation pressing on her ribs, knowing the feast was only the opening act. Ashanti weddings, for instance, wrapped brides in cloth so bright and heavy it felt like a banner draped over a single body. Gold gleamed everywhere, on necklaces, anklets, and even in the woven thread of the garments. The bride was transformed into wealth incarnate, proof that her family carried prosperity. But beneath the gold, she trembled. Every bangle that clinked was a reminder of chains she could not remove. The Ethiopian courts, with their Christian ceremonies, added their own layer of solemnity. Brides were blessed by priests, incense clouding the air so thick it blurred the faces of guests. Hymns echoed, candles flickered, and sacred words declared her bound forever. The people saw holiness. She felt the tremor in her knees as her future loomed like the shadow of the church dome itself. What united these traditions was the brutal contrast between public celebration and private fear. Outside, dancers leapt, drums thundered, guests feasted. Inside, the bride sat in a chamber draped with woven mats and decorated with cowrie shells, waiting for the moment everyone outside pretended not to think about. Her trembling was invisible to the crowd, but all too real in the silence of the chamber. Virginity, too, was a matter of politics. In many kingdoms, the proof of consummation was demanded by families. Bedding was checked, gossip spread, and whispers decided reputations. If the alliance faltered, if heirs did not come, if whispers grew too loud, a bride could be discarded. Her trembling on that first night replayed endlessly in rumour. The politics of Europe and Asia had their counterparts here. Dynasties depended on her body, and her fear was irrelevant. The rituals of fertility made things worse. In some places, brides were surrounded with symbols of abundance, calabashes of milk, gourds of honey, or live animals tethered nearby. Chickens might be released in the chamber, their frantic flapping meant to bring luck. Imagine sitting on a woven mat, your heart hammering, while a chicken crashes into the bedpost. Terrifying, yes, but also absurd, the kind of scene history never records with a smile. Even the songs carried pressure. Griots sang verses praising the bride's purity, the groom's strength, the children yet to come. Their words drifted through the night, echoing into the chamber. For the princess, those verses were not blessings, but demands. She sat trembling, listening to the crowd sing of airs while she struggled to breathe. Each line felt like another weight placed on her chest. And beyond the rituals, there was the personal fear. Many brides were married to men much older, men they barely knew. A young Ashanti princess might be bound to a seasoned warrior, or a regional chief whose reputation for cruelty was whispered among the servants. An Ethiopian princess might be sent to secure an alliance with a distant noble whose eyes she had only glimpsed once across a banquet hall. The trembling wasn't mystery. It was dread of a stranger who now defined her life. Absurdities crept in even here. Some grooms drank so much palm wine they never made it to the chamber. Others fell asleep at the feast, leaving brides stranded with gossiping attendants. Chroniclers mention weddings where guests pounded drums so loudly all night that the bridal chamber shook with noise, making any intimacy impossible. Imagine trembling in fear while outside someone plays the same rhythm on a drum for 6 hours straight. Romance dies quickly when the bass line won't stop. Yet the trembling of African princesses, like their counterparts elsewhere, was recast as virtue. Fear was renamed modesty, silence was renamed obedience, and tears were simply not mentioned. A bride who trembled was praised for her humility. No one asked whether her trembling came from terror or joy. It didn't matter. The narrative was already written. Picture her again, seated on a mat woven with geometric patterns, cowrie shells glinting in the lamplight, her wrists heavy with gold, her eyes wide beneath kohl. Outside, drums thunder, griots sing, warriors laugh. Inside, she sits with her heart racing, hands clenched, breath shallow. The door closes, the world waits, and she trembles in the silence. History records the alliances sealed, the kingdoms united, the heirs born. It does not record the chicken feathers stuck to her blanket, the sting of smoke in her eyes, the whispered prayer to ancestors to make the night pass quickly. But if you lean close, past the pounding drums and clashing cymbals of history, you can hear her. An African princess, trembling in the lamplit dark, her heartbeat faster than the drum outside, her silence louder than the songs. The torches flare against stone temples, the scent of burning copal resin thick in the night air, and the sound of drums echoes like thunder across plazas where pyramids rise against the stars. You picture yourself stepping into the heart of an Aztec city, or perhaps into a Maya court, where the people gathered not only to feast, but to watch the union of dynasties that they believed mirrored the will of the gods. For the princess at the centre of it, the night was dazzling, suffocating, and terrifying all at once. The world outside roared with celebration, while inside her chamber the silence pressed down harder than the stones of the temple itself. Aztec weddings were layered in ritual. First came the omens. Priests studied the stars, the smoke of incense, even the way birds flew overhead. If the signs were good, the ceremonies began. The princess was bathed in sacred water, her hair painted with ochre, her body wrapped in shimmering cotton woven with feathers and jade beads. She looked like a living offering, because in a sense she was. Her marriage was not about her. It was about binding cities, sealing alliances, and keeping the gods appeased. Imagine trembling beneath the weight of feathers and jade, knowing every eye saw you not as a girl, but as a piece of cosmic currency. The Maya were no less elaborate. Royal brides were draped in garments painted with symbols of maize and sun, fertility and power. Shamans muttered incantations, scattering cacao beans as offerings. The marriage wasn't just a contract between families, it was a renewal of cosmic balance. The bride was told she carried the fate of her people in her womb. No pressure, just the sun, the moon, and the crops, depending on whether she trembled too much. The rituals themselves could be absurd in their intensity. In Aztec practice, the bride and groom's garments were literally tied together with knots to symbolize unity. Picture sitting there, shaking with fear, while a priest fiddles with your clothing like he's securing a tent flap. Guests clapped, musicians played conch shells, and the bride sat motionless, wrapped in metaphor and fabric. The trembling under her sleeves wasn't noticed, or rather it was noticed and praised. Modesty, they said. Obedience. But for the girl herself, it was the silent protest of her body against being handed to gods and men alike. The chamber itself was designed to scream symbolism. Beds were strewn with maize kernels and flowers, the walls hung with woven cloth bearing images of eagles and serpents. Candles flickered, incense smoked, and outside drums pounded into the night, keeping time with the bride's racing heart. The people celebrated with feasts of turkey, maize cakes, and cacao, but the princess tasted only the bitterness of fear. Each tremor of her hands, each shiver of her body, was swallowed by the thick incense curling around her like a second veil. Astrology played its role too. Among the Maya, dates were chosen according to the sacred calendar, ensuring the marriage aligned with cosmic rhythms. If the day was unlucky, the union might be postponed, or rushed to avoid disaster. Imagine being told your wedding night was dictated not by your wishes but by the mood of Venus in the morning sky. Trembling was inevitable when the heavens themselves seemed to loom over your chamber. And then there was the fear of failure. In Aztec society, fertility was sacred. A bride who failed to bear children was whispered about, accused of angering the gods, or worse, suspected of curses. The wedding night wasn't simply intimacy. It was a test of her usefulness. One slip, one rumour, and she could find herself disgraced, discarded, or sent into lonely exile. For a trembling princess, the chamber was less a sanctuary and more a courtroom where the gods themselves served as judges. Absurd moments crept into the solemnity. Chroniclers mention feasts so heavy that grooms stumbled into chambers bloated from too much maize beer, collapsing before anything could begin. Others describe brides so weighed down with feathers and beads that it took attendants half an hour to untangle them. Imagine trembling on a bed covered in maize while your new husband wrestles with your headdress like it's a stubborn piece of furniture. The absurdity didn't erase the fear, though. The bride's trembling was constant, an undercurrent beneath every symbol, every chant, every gesture. And yet, in the eyes of her people, it was transformed into virtue. Fear became purity, trembling became humility, silence became grace. Her body screamed with terror, but the crowd saw only a living icon of obedience. Picture her now, seated in a lamplit chamber, feathers cascading from her shoulders, jade beads clinking faintly as she shifts. Outside, drums beat like a second heartbeat, echoing her own. Incense curls through the air, shadows of serpents and eagles dancing across the woven walls. The groom enters, the veil of smoke swallows them, and the world waits. She trembles, whispers prayers to gods carved in stone, and wonders whether her heartbeat is loud enough for the ancestors to hear. History tells us the marriages secured alliances, strengthened dynasties, renewed cosmic balance. It does not tell us about the tears soaking into maize-strewn blankets, the ache in her shoulders from heavy feathers, the desperate wish to vanish into the smoke. But if you listen closely, past the pounding drums and the chants of priests, you can hear her still, an Aztec or Maya princess, trembling in a chamber that smelled of fire and flowers, her fear lost in the rhythm of the empire. The torches gutter in stone corridors, shadows stretching long like accusing fingers, and the air carries the faint musk of candle smoke mixed with nervous sweat. You picture yourself slipping into yet another chamber, though this one feels colder, heavier, its atmosphere less about celebration and more about scrutiny. Because here, across countless empires, the wedding night was not simply private, it was proof. A princess was not just a bride, she was a treaty written in flesh, and her virginity was the seal. Without it, the alliance crumbled. Without it, her body was declared defective, her worth diminished. The trembling in her bones wasn't modesty. It was the knowledge that her body was about to be turned into evidence. This obsession cut across cultures like a scar. In medieval Europe, sheets were displayed after the night, stained or not, as the kingdom's most intimate press release. In Persia, whispers of failure could undo decades of negotiation. In India, elders might press anxious ears against chamber doors, waiting for any sound to prove that duty had been done. In China, attendants carried the linens out discreetly, knowing their silence or speech could decide a bride's future. The bed was not simply a bed. It was an examination table, and the examiners were the court, the family, and the state. For the princess herself, the fear of this proof was crushing. Some girls bled, some did not, but the expectation was iron. No matter her body, the world demanded a stain. Imagine trembling under blankets, knowing that whether or not your body complied, gossip would gnaw at you for the rest of your life. The sheets became a battlefield, and her body the terrain. And if she failed, annulment, exile, whispers of witchcraft, or a quick replacement by a more compliant bride. Even the rituals reflected this obsession. In France, entire entourages escorted couples to bed, cheering as though they were seeing off soldiers to war. In Ottoman courts, eunuchs lingered outside, waiting for word. In Ethiopia, elders blessed the sheets before the couple even touched them, as though invoking divine ink for the treaty about to be signed. And in the Aztec world, priests muttered chants over maize-strewn beds, ensuring the gods themselves were witnesses. Privacy was a fantasy. Proof was the goal. The absurdity, of course, is impossible to ignore. Imagine kings and queens of Europe waiting anxiously for maids to deliver damp linens as though they were sacred scrolls, or Persian viziers sitting stiffly, sipping sherbet, while eunuchs whispered about whether the groom had fulfilled his duty, or Chinese ministers gossiping over whether the red veil had been lifted with enough vigour to impress the ancestors. All of history's pomp and power balanced on whether or not a princess had a slightly awkward first night. It's as if the fate of empires hinged not on armies or harvest, but on laundry. But for the trembling bride, none of it was funny. She knew her body was being weaponized. She knew her silence was not her own, her fear not her own, her bed not her own. Every nerve in her body screamed that she was about to be reduced to a mark on cloth, a whisper in a corridor, a rumour carried through banquet halls. She trembled because she had no shield, no defence, only the hope that her body would cooperate with the myth of purity that had been forced upon it. And the stakes extended far beyond that night. If a princess was deemed untainted, her children would be accepted as heirs, dynasties would remain stable, wars would be averted. If she was judged otherwise, the consequences could be catastrophic. Wars might ignite, thrones might topple, her family's honour might collapse. Imagine knowing that your womb was considered the hinge on which the entire kingdom swung, and that any sign of deviation would slam the door shut on peace. Some brides tried to resist. There are whispers of princesses who wept openly, who screamed, who fainted before the bed could prove anything. Their stories often end in silence, erased, rewritten, or buried in chronicles that praised the treaty but ignored the girl. Others endured quietly, their trembling written into history as modesty, their fear mistaken for virtue. And a rare few, those with cunning or luck, managed to bend the narrative, presenting stained sheets regardless of truth, enlisting maids or midwives to assist with proof. Their trembling was not just fear, but calculation, survival masquerading as obedience. Absurd comedy sometimes leaked through the cracks. One European courtier recorded a wedding night where the groom was too inebriated to perform, so attendants faked the stained linens with chicken blood. Another tale from the Ottoman palace tells of eunuchs staging noises outside the chamber to convince the court of success. History loves its serious treaties, but behind closed curtains, it was sometimes a farce of poultry and sound effects. Still, for the bride, the trembling was real, because if the deception failed, her life could be destroyed. Picture her again, seated on the edge of a bed, silk sheets gleaming under candlelight, her hands clenched in her lap. Outside, footsteps shift, voices murmur, the empire waits. She knows that when dawn comes, someone will look at the linens, someone will weigh her worth, someone will decide whether she's queen or exile. Her body trembles not from mystery but from certainty. She's about to be turned into a verdict. History, of course, records the outcomes, the treaty secured, the heirs born, the dynasties preserved. It does not record the quiver in her lip, the silent tears on silk, the desperate prayer that her body would cooperate with the myth. But if you lean close, if you listen past the rustle of sheets and the pomp of courts, you can hear her, a princess across civilizations, trembling not for herself but for the weight of empires pressing down on her heart. The night grows slower now, softer, as though history itself is weary of recounting all these trembling hearts. You picture a long corridor fading into shadows, the last torch sputtering low, and beyond it a chamber where silence rests heavier than silk. We've wandered from Rome to Byzantium, from India to the Americas, and everywhere the pattern is the same. Princesses pressed into gilded cages, their wedding nights transformed into verdicts, and now, in this final stretch, the echoes settle. They don't shout anymore, they whisper. The whispers belong to the brides themselves. Imagine them layered one upon another, an Egyptian child staring wide-eyed at a golden bed, a Roman girl dragged across the threshold, a Byzantine princess praying before jewelled icons, an Ottoman bride trembling beneath her veil, a Maya noblewoman breathing incense so thick it burned her lungs. They are scattered across centuries, across continents, yet their voices hum in unison. We were afraid. It is the one truth that all the gold, incense, prayers and treaties cannot mask. And the fear was never trivial. It was political, cosmic, familial. The trembling wasn't simply nerves. It was the body's rebellion against being reduced to proof. When her hands shook, when her lip quivered, when her pulse raced, it was because she knew that her body would be judged not as hers but as her kingdom's property. History wrote treaties, but her flesh bore the seal. That knowledge crept into every heartbeat, and the body answered with tremors it could not hide. But listen closely, and you'll find something else tangled in those whispers. Resilience. Despite the fear, these brides endured. Some learned to wield influence quietly, whispering in their husbands' ears until their words bent policy. Others carved power for themselves through alliances with mothers, brothers, or courtiers. Even in trembling, they endured nights that could have broken them. Their fear was real, but so was their survival. Absurdities litter the silence like crumbs after a banquet. Somewhere, a medieval groom snored himself into legend while his bride sat awake staring at the rafters. Somewhere else, a Byzantine eunuch invented noises to trick courtiers into believing the marriage was sealed. A French noblewoman may have fainted into her sheets while ladies-in-waiting fanned her with peacock feathers, debating whether fainting counted as consummation. And surely in China, a bride weighed down with beads and hairpins must have thought, if I trip under all this, at least they'll call me graceful on the way down. Even in fear there was absurdity, and perhaps that absurdity gave them a fleeting moment of relief. And yet, beneath the laughter, the fear endures. Because the wedding night was never about the girl. It was about kingdoms, heirs, omens, sheets and whispers. That's why the trembling matters, not because it was seen as weakness, but because it was the truest thing in the room. A princess trembling in candlelight was more honest than any priest's blessing, more real than any treaty, more eternal than the silks or jewels. Her body told the truth. She was terrified, and she was human. Now the pace softens. Imagine those chambers again, but quieter this time. The torches dim, the incense smoke thins, the drums fade into silence. Instead of hearing the crowd's laughter or the priest's chants, you hear only the small sounds, the rustle of silk as a girl shifts her weight, the faint tap of bangles against each other, the uneven rhythm of breath drawn too fast. It is late. The world outside has stopped demanding, stopped listening. For the first time, the trembling is not a performance. It is simply hers. And you, lying here now, listening in the dark, can let those whispers fade into something softer. No more sheets paraded through halls, no more astrologers muttering about unlucky stars, no more maids gossiping at doors. Just the steady hush of night, where all those frightened brides finally exhale. Their trembling quiets, their bodies rest, and the weight of empires slips away into dreams. You'd probably never make it through a single medieval night, but you don't have to. You can simply lie here, breathe slow, and let their stories drift past like lanterns on water. So before you sink deeper, loosen your shoulders, unclench your jaw. Notice how the air feels softer now, how the edges of the world blur like candlelight through silk. Imagine the red veils falling, the incense curling into nothing, the drums dissolving into silence. Picture the curtains closing one last time, not for scrutiny, but for rest. All the trembling voices, all the anxious heartbeats, dissolve into a single quiet hum. The sound of history finally exhaling. And now, as the night deepens, let yourself exhale too. Let the torches burn out. Let the music fade. Let the weight of empires drift far away. You're safe here, outside the scrutiny of courts and chambers, outside the judgment of history. Just a quiet room, a soft bed, and the steady rhythm of your own breath carrying you into sleep. So dim the lights in your mind. Let the silk curtains draw closed. Let trembling dissolve into stillness, fear into calm. And as you drift, remember, even across centuries, even through gold and politics and treaties, every princess's heartbeat was just like yours. Fragile, steady, human, and in the end, all those trembling voices fade into the same thing. Silence, rest, peace. Now close your eyes. The story has grown quiet. The journey is complete. The trembling has stopped. Sleep comes.